All right, make sure the camera's on and that we're live. So we started talking about corporate social responsibility last time. We finished talking about marketing theory, as I recall. And we were on the topic of Walmart, which is one of my favorite companies to hate. Mostly because I have to go to Walmart and it's always a miserable experience. I have found evidence that the Yeti exists and they're at the Guthrie Walmart. They're always in front of me in line with their thousands of Yeti children. And I'm like a man going to the gallows when I have to go to Walmart, right? So what's today's date? The 27th. Walmart has become a success largely in their ability to reverse the power structure in the channel. And we started talking about this last time, that historically manufacturers had all of the power in the channel because they set the initial price and they could determine who they were going to sell to. And Walmart, because they're the largest seller of so many things, at least until Amazon came along, was able to say things like, we're going to sell this product at this price. If you want to sell it to us, you're going to sell it at this price. And I told you that there was a company that actually said no to Walmart, which was Snapper Tools. And then Snapper reversed course, right? They came to an understanding because the average Walmart customer wants to spend about $100 on a lawnmower, and they may use it for 1 or 2 seasons and then, get a new lawnmower. So that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of ethical import to it until you really start thinking about it. Because now all of a sudden Walmart is determining what other people can make, and that impacts what those manufacturers are able to pay, for example, their distributors, their employees, the kinds of benefits and things like that that they would pay their employees. And we've seen a total, in the last half century, transformation in the way people are retiring. So historically, when my grandparents went to work for a company, they got a pension plan. This is something that I have that most of you will never have. It's one of the reasons that I chose to go into education was because I have a defined benefit plan, which means that when I retire, I know how much money I will make for the rest of my life. And most people who retire from education, actually, my best friend and my former boss here at UCO retired, and he got $1,000 a month pay raise. Because between drawing Social Security and teachers' retirement, he takes home $1,000 a month more than he did when he was working. That's not something most of you will do. It used to be the stereotypical case that companies offered pensions and employees stayed with the company for a long period of time, but that's all changed. And one of the reasons it's changed is because of things like Walmart, because of this cost-cutting reduction. It's like, they don't offer that kind of benefit. And I told you that there was a woman in Guthrie who worked her way up, and she had $1 million in profit sharing when she retired. And that's not the way Walmart works anymore. They don't give stock grants anymore. And they have most of their employees are now part-time. And so they've attempted to reduce costs. Now, if we think about the ethical theories, what would utilitarians say about this kind of reduction in cost? Yeah, we get all kinds of stuff really, really cheaply as a result of Walmart's reverse power distribution in the channel, and also their cost-cutting devices through having mostly part-time work. at one point in time, Walmart was actually telling their employees how they could go get on public assistance benefits because they qualify for things like Medicaid. So ultimately, we're all paying a little bit for Walmart's not providing their employees with great benefits, right? But what do we get out of it? We get really cheap stuff. Really, I mean, like, we have everything that we want, you know, at a substantial discount or substantial cost savings. So Amazon is now taking this to a higher art form, and that, you know, I told you that they're now delivering it to your door. And how can they do that? How can they afford to give you next day service, or in some cases, same day service on these things that you order online? Well, they're doing it by paying their employees very little, and employees are you know, so desperate that they're, because they have standards, and if they don't meet the standards, they have a forced distribution and they get rid of them, that they're peeing in bottles to keep their job. So I think a duty ethicist would say this is just wrong to treat people this way, to treat people like cogs and machines. This is a reversion to sort of the scientific method in terms of management theory that we saw in the early part of the 20th century, and it was enormously dehumanizing. So this goes back to a German sociologist named Max Weber. And Weber said that the ideal form of organization is a bureaucracy. And he said there were three characteristics of a bureaucracy, and we think of bureaucracies as being hierarchical, right? So at the top, you have the CEO or the president, and below that, you have vice presidents, and below that, you have directors, right? And below that, you have managers, and then supervisors, and then these frontline, and there are more and more boxes. And Weber said that the ideal bureaucracy has three characteristics in that it is specialized. So one is specialization. Two, it has a hierarchy. And three, it is rule bound, follows rules. And Weber viewed these people who fill these roles in these little boxes as cogs in a machine. And if the cog isn't working, it's sort of like the way cars work today. When I was a kid growing up, people actually sort of worked on cars, and you had people who were what we call shade tree mechanics that could work on their own cars. How many of you can work on your own car today? A couple, but most people can't. They're computerized, and most of the systems are not systems that you can fix. If it goes out, you simply replace it. Transmissions, for example, there used to be all kinds of shops. If you went through any small town, there would be 2 or 3 transmission shops, and they would actually rebuild your transmission. They don't do that anymore. Most transmissions are closed systems, which means that when it goes bad, you just buy a new one. You pull the transmission out and you plug a new transmission into it. And that's what Weber viewed people as. He's like, we could fill these slots, and if the cog is not working, you just pull it out, you fire it, and you replace it. And then we get Taylor's scientific management, which builds on this. And the idea is, how do we do things the most efficient? So, you know, they did all kinds of studies. In steel mills, for example, how do you make steel? Well, you take, I think it's iron ore and something else, and you fire it. And how do you fire it? Well, they used, at that time, coal burning furnaces, if I recall correctly. And they did studies on exactly what the right amount of shovel size would be in order for somebody to be able to shovel coal. If you get a shovel that's too light, what happens? Well, you have to use too many shovel strokes to get the coal into the fire. If the shovel is too heavy, the worker can't lift it. So there's, an ideal weight there. Now this seems really great, but it's a little dehumanizing. I mean, this goes back to the philosophy part of our conversation. Nietzsche, at the beginning of the 20th century, people were very optimistic about the idea that science would be able to solve all of our problems. And Nietzsche looks around and says, you people are crazy. The world is not getting better, it's getting scarier. And he's sort of prophetic. This is before World War I and World War II. And the scientific method allowed for destruction and killing on a scale that human beings had never seen before, culminating in the dropping of an atomic bomb on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Nietzsche says this, by the way, is postmodernity. The world is a really frightening place. It's not getting better, and science is not necessarily making it better. In fact, Nietzsche's most famous quote is, as a result of our belief in science, that God is dead and we've killed it. Because we've so come to believe in the power of science. And science has done a lot of good. There's definitely an enormous amount of good that science has done. We cure things. We're living longer, but we're also doing colossal damage to our planet. And so we have to think about these things, right? So the classical model of corporate social responsibility is rooted in neoclassical economic theory, and Milton Friedman is sort of the father of this neoclassical movement. And he grounds it in something that is near and dear to the hearts of Americans, more so than any other country on earth, in the theory of property rights. I used to teach American national government, and when I taught that course, I had my students, because we're supposed to have some kind of writing component to courses so that this is not just about filling in bubbles on a Scantron. And again, I'll remind you that this is a good point to remind you that if you did the exam, I haven't graded the essay portion. So if you see that grade, don't freak out just yet, because I've still got to grade the essay, and the computer doesn't do that. D2L will automatically grade the objective part, but the essay I actually have to go in and grade. So Friedman largely bases this theory on laissez-faire economics and the idea of property rights. And again, when I used to teach American national government, I would have my students write this essay because I didn't want them to have to write a term paper, because those are just enormously painful for me to grade. Term papers are just, like a traditional research paper is just enormously painful for professors to grade. The undergraduate degree is not about really doing research, and it's, when we ask you to do it, it's usually done poorly. And by the time I get through, and in a course of 50 people or 60 people, when I taught American national government, that was the standard class size, was 40 or 50 people. I wanted to stab myself in the eye to deal with the pain of having to read these things. So I started coming up with these alternatives, and one of the ones that I came up with when I taught American national government was an assignment called My American Dream, because it was easier for me. I didn't have to go and check your sources and make sure you weren't plagiarizing, because how do you plagiarize my American dream, right? This is something that's deeply rooted in American culture, the idea of the American dream. And by the way, it's antithetical to other countries. Nobody says, when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, nobody says my German dream, right? I mean, they don't say that. But in America, we have this idea. And what is the American dream? Well, for most people, a big part of the American dream is to own a home. This is, again, antithetical to lots of other countries, because in many places, people will never own a home. Land is expensive, it's scarce, and they'll live in an apartment or something like that for their entire life. And this is part of an American culture. In very few places do we find people that don't have this dream of owning a home. Maybe New York City. I used to own a business that recruited nurses from Canada to come across on H-1B visas to American hospitals. And we were very successful. And one of my partners in that business lived in New York, and she was 60 years old, and she had bought her first home. And when she came to Oklahoma to visit me one time, she was astounded. At the time, I lived in Edgemere Park, and I had a 1,700 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. And she asked me what I paid for it. And at that time, you can't buy a home in Edgemere at this point for what I paid for my house. I paid $125,000 for the house. It had hardwood floors throughout and Pullman ceilings and all of these really cool woodwork. And she had just bought, at 70 years old, she had just bought her first home. She'd lived in an apartment all of her life. She bought a co-op, which is an apartment basically, but it's condos, so you own from the walls in. And she paid $1 million for it. And it was 900 square feet. I mean, she was just, my house sat on, I think, 7 lots. So I had this big backyard and I had dogs, and I mean, it was great. And she was just amazed at that. But outside of New York, the reason I tell you the story is that, like most people, their dream is to own a home, right? You, in theory, own all the way to the center of the earth and all the way to the heavens. And so this theory is grounded in property rights and laissez-faire economics. And so Friedman says that the only ethical duty corporations have is to make a profit for their shareholders. This idea of doing anything other than making a profit is basically stealing from your shareholders. So your whole goal is to make a profit, and anything else is unethical, according to Friedman. Now, one of the problems with this is that Friedman fundamentally misunderstands property rights from a legal sense, from a legal standpoint. Again, he's an economist, and I tell you that marketing is rooted in 2 foundational disciplines, economics and philosophy, or economics and psychology, not philosophy, both of which I will make merciless fun of. It's a fundamental misunderstanding on Friedman's part of property rights. What is property? If I ask you, what is property?
It's the land that you own.
Land? Is that the only type of property? No, what else?
I mean, technically, it could be any place or thing. This is my property.
Okay, that's your property. Some of the things that you think of as being property are property, and some of the things that you might think of as being property are not property, right? So one of the things that you might not think of as being property are intangible things that are property.
Like intellectual property.
Intellectual property, yeah. Trademark, copyright, patent. Those are not things that you can touch, taste, feel or smell necessarily, but you have a property right in them. That property right can extinguish. Some of the other things that you might think of, so real property is property. It's the land and those things attached to the land. That's real property. Now it becomes interesting when you start thinking about that in terms of selling stuff, as opposed to personal property, what is it that makes it real property? Is this podium, for example, real property or personal property? Personal property are what we call chattels. These are things that you can generally easily move. So is this personal property or real property? It's personal property. What about the projector up there? I know it's attached.
Well, you could unscrew it.
You could unscrew it, but how difficult is it? What about an air conditioning system? Is that real or personal property?
Real.
Generally speaking, when you buy a house, you don't like strip the house of the air conditioning system, although you could unattach it. You don't strip the house of the air conditioning system and move it. And there are differences in real and personal property in terms of some of the things that you have. But property is something, and this is where Frieden doesn't fundamentally understand things. Property is a grant of the sovereign, and that which the sovereign grants, the sovereign can take away. Property is defined in the law by the sovereign. Now, in Great Britain, who is the sovereign? The Queen is the sovereign. In the United States, who is the sovereign? No. The people are sovereign in the United States. In theory, that which we grant, we can take away, and we can limit, and we do limit it. In terms of intellectual property, it goes away. When you file a patent, at some point in time, that patent is extinguished. Copyright, things go into the public domain, and it's extinguished. That property right is extinguished. So Friedman bases this whole argument on a fundamental misunderstanding of property. Property rights are not absolute. You can't, in theory, when you buy your house, you own from the ground to the center of the earth and all the way to the heavens, but not really. That property is limited. You cannot, if you buy a house in the city of Edmond, I can guarantee you that if your dream is to own a double wide home, they're not going to let you put that double wide home on a lot in Edmond, or not very many places in Edmond, Oklahoma. We don't let you do it in Guthrie. We have a prohibition against putting manufactured homes on most places in Guthrie. Why? Because that decreases the property values of your neighbors. You can't put a skunk works in the middle of your, you decide, I have this house, I want to manufacture, tanned hides. I'm going to run some cattle in here, and I'm going to start slaughtering them and tanning leather. No, you can't do that. It's limited, because if you do that, particularly in the city limits, what happens to everybody else's property values? It diminishes their property value. You can't do it. So we have zoning laws, right? Friedman, of course, argues for an extreme laissez-faire approach to business. Completely capitalistic. There's problems with that. It's called market failures. Things where the market doesn't account for that. Like clean air, clean water. If we allow people to just do what they want, let's suppose you have a stream that runs through your property. I was born and raised in New Mexico, and New Mexico's bar is enormously, at one time, it's the most difficult bar in the country because of the property and the riparian rights, the water rights that people had in New Mexico are sacred. And you can sell your water rights, you can sever them from the property, and they're as valuable as oil in New Mexico. New Mexico's a desert, right? So let's suppose, portions, the Rio Grande starts in New Mexico. let's suppose that you have part of the Rio Grande that runs through your property. Can you run your sewage pipe out to the Rio Grande and pollute the river? No, because that will affect property rights of people downstream from you. To allow you to do that would be to allow for a market failure, right? You would have an incentive. I mean, like, it's expensive to dig sewer lines and things like that, isn't it? Just be easier to have a pipe that just runs out, and, the river carries it away. No, can't do that. So property rights are subject to regulation, and they're subject to being taken away by the sovereign. So externalities such as market failures that I've illustrated are part of the problems with the classical model of corporate social responsibility. The tragedy of the common. And property rights are limited. We limit all kinds of property rights, right? So corporations can be limited in the same way. Corporations, again, are creations of the sovereign. And you get enormous benefits as a result of your corporate status. What kinds of benefits do you get as a result of corporate status? What does the corporate law allow you to do? Why do we allow people to have corporations? What is a corporation? So I told you last time that politicians get in trouble when they tell the truth. And someone was in a crowd at a Mitt Romney rally, and they started talking about the evils of corporations, and Mitt Romney, I think I told you, said, "Corporations are people, my friends." And everybody at the rally starts laughing, and they're legal people. Why do we allow for them? What is it that we allow? Why is it that we allow corporations? Well, when we talk about business models and forms of business ownership, there are a number of forms that a business can take, right? So what are the forms that a business can take? The easiest and simplest form of business to start is a sole proprietorship, or a DBA. That stands for doing business as. I could do this, and I have. I have a law practice. I continue to have clients, and I can, do I have to? Now, one of the things you have to recognize with this is you cannot confuse the ease of creation of the business with the substantive law that may regulate that business. So I can start a DBA. I have a law practice, and I have clients, and it doesn't cost me anything to do it. I don't have to tell the state of Oklahoma that I'm starting a law practice. That's as opposed to the substantive law, which deals with the practice of law. Can you start a law practice? Can you go out and hang a shingle out that says, Mr. or Ms. so-and-so, attorney at law, Esquire? The answer is no, because that would be called the unauthorized practice of law, and the bar would visit you when you did this, and you could be convicted of a crime, right? Because there's a substantive law that governs who can practice law, but within the substantive law of business organization, which is different, I can start this. Now, what's a business that you could start that doesn't require any licensure, and you could do it on your own? You wouldn't have to go out and tell the state that you're starting it. You could just start it on your own. There are lots of businesses that you could start that are not regulated by the state that you could be on your own. One of my first students that graduated when I first became a member of the faculty of the College of Business years and years ago. I started as a member of the faculty of liberal arts. One of my first students came in to me. He was graduating with a business student. I was teaching legal studies at the time, not marketing. And he came in and he said, Professor Geary, I got my first marketing job offer. And I said, that's great, Daniel. And I said, what is it? He said, it's $30,000 to be a marketing communications specialist with, and I can't remember the company. And I said, that's fantastic. He said, yeah, the problem is that I made $150,000 last year mowing yards. He grew up in Edmond. He had started, his parents bought him a lawnmower, and with that, he went around the neighborhood as a kid, offering to mow neighbors' yards for money. And he mowed their yards, and then he bought, a weed eater and an edger, and then he bought, when he was 16, when he turned 16, he bought his own truck and a trailer, and then he built this into a little business where he now had other people that were working for him. And I said, well, if your marketing degree here at UCO taught you anything, it's that you should keep mowing yards, right? I mean, like that, you've obviously got to, and there's no licensure to mow yards at this point. Maybe in the future, there will be. Right? There are certifications for arborists and things like that, but you don't have to have that to cut down trees and mow yards and stuff like that. You can just do it. And you can have a DBA. Now, what's the advantage of this? Well, it's easy to start. I get myself a lawnmower, and I go out and I start mowing yards, and I have a weed eater. What's the problem with the DBA? I don't have to go file anything with the state. I don't have to tell anybody, and I can just pay my taxes and go on down the road. The problem with this is, let's suppose that you start your own lawn business. Life is inherently risky, right? If you get sick, all of a sudden you can't mow yards anymore. Let's suppose you have some dreaded disease like cancer, and your business may suffer. So maybe what you want to do is you want to team up with somebody, and so you can have another type of business, which is called a partnership, which is like a DBA, except now you have more than one person. So if I don't feel good that day, my partner can go out and mow the yards. I can, we can split up the duties. I take off 2 days a week, and he takes off 2 days a week, and we have different days off. And so we can mow 7 days a week and not have a lapse in coverage. Because there's lots of yards to mow here in the land of the shallow and pretentious, known as Edmond. And nobody in Edmond knows their own yard. They also don't seem to cook. It's one of the most fascinating things. Can't tell you how many of my friends live here in the land of the shallow, because they're shallow, pretentious. And they have these gourmet kitchens that they've never used because they don't cook. They eat out every meal. So what's wrong with this? Well, now we've got two people. Now, under a sole proprietorship, if I hit a rock, yard mowing is dangerous work, isn't it? How many of you mowed a yard? Almost everybody. Okay. You hit a rock, and what happens to the rock that you hit in the mower?
It's somebody's car.
It goes shooting out the side, right? You buy your cheap mower from Walmart that doesn't have a bag on it or whatever, and the rock goes spinning out and hits somebody in the eye. Now, what happens? So you're liable for that tort. That's a tort. Right? And now if I start a partnership, now my partner can mow. We're mowing 7 days a week, but he's careless and he hits, lots of rocks and hits people in the eye. And now I'm not only liable for my stuff, I'm liable for him under this. So what do we do to solve this? Well, you can have a corporation. Corporations are creations of the state. one of the first states to create corporations in the United States was Delaware. Delaware basically wrote the code on corporations, so lots of corporations are incorporated in Delaware. The Bank of New York, where do you think that's incorporated? Well, it's the Bank of New York. You would think it's incorporated in New York. It's not, it's a Delaware corporation. Disney, where is Disney largely located? Where did Disney start out?
It started out in California.
Started out in California. And the first Disneyland is in California. What is Disney? It's a Delaware corporation. Delaware wrote the code for a lot of this stuff. Corporations allow you to limit your liability to your investment. So now, as the owner of this corporation, my friend and I decided I can't be liable for him. He doesn't want to be liable for me. We form a corporation. We put it on our truck that we're incorporated. And now, when he hits somebody with the mower, he throws a rock and hits somebody in the eye with the mower. I'm only liable for my investment in the corporation. And the corporation can go bankrupt if we get sued for a large amount of money. The point of this is that corporations, now there are other types of, there have been, as a result of more modernizations, these were the three original types of corporation, or three types of organizations that you could have for a business. We now have, under the corporate form, we have a variety of different things like LLCs, LLC, LLP, which are limited liability partnerships, professional corporations, things like that have different ways of organizing. The advantage of these other types of organizations, historically, the disadvantage of a corporate form was that because the corporation is, what did I tell you it is? Mitt Romney said it in his corporations are what? Corporations are people, my friend. The disadvantage of this corporate form, you get this protection from liability. What does this protection from liability allow you to do? Well, it allows you to pool capital to build stuff. How did Ford become such a huge powerhouse in automobile manufacturing? If everybody who invested in Ford stock was personally liable for the torts that Ford created, nobody would invest in Ford stock. You all are way too young to remember this, but I remember when I was a kid, there was a model of Ford that came out called the Pinto. And it was a really cheap car. It was a really, really cheap vehicle, the Ford Pinto. And it turns out that there was a design defect in the Pinto that if you were hit from behind where the gas tank was located, it would explode. Poof, gone. It further turns out that the executives and engineers at Ford knew about this little problem. But they had done this thing, and if you recall, when we went back, when we talked about utilitarianism, one of the problems that I highlighted with utilitarianism was this idea of doing the calculus of a human life. And I said, let's suppose we have a drug, we've manufactured a drug, and for a dreaded illness that's highly communicable, and there are 5 doses of the drug, and well, we have 6 people that are infected with the communicable disease. And I did this whole thing. I said, there's you, there's me, there's Mother Teresa, right? There's Donald Trump. There's Barack Obama and some smelly guy named Bob who we think is a homeless person, right? And we started doing the calculus on what is the value of a human life. Well, it turns out that there is a science to this called actuarial science, and I think I told you that. We have the only degree in the state that will tell you these things, that will tell you that a child without a birth defect is worth more than a child with a birth defect. That's just creepy, isn't it? It's creepy, but we do it. Well, turns out that Ford had done the numbers and they projected out, and this is easy to do in a scientific world, how many people are going to die. And the average person who drove a Ford Pinto, we're not talking the people who drove Ford Pintos, by and large, on the whole, were not doctors and lawyers. They were lower class people. And their lives are not worth very much, actuarially. And they had decided that based on the number of people that were likely to die in fiery car crashes, that rather than recalling the vehicle, they just pay them out. They would just pay the claims out on this. Now, if everybody who invested in Ford, when things like this come out in trials, by the way, in every other place besides Oklahoma and Texas, where juries are very stingy, juries hear these kinds of things and they tend to assess huge sums of money, not in actual damages. So they'll say, yeah, this person is not worth a whole lot, but you've acted in bad faith, corporation, and we're going to assess punitive damages against you. Now, if everybody who had invested in Ford was personally on the line for those punitive damages, which can run into the millions and billions of dollars, nobody would invest in Ford, would they? No, they wouldn't. It's too risky. If I invest $10 in Ford stock and all of a sudden I have unlimited liability, I'm not going to invest in this thing. So what we've done as a society is we've said, look, there's a utilitarian benefit to corporations. We can now pool money. That allows us to raise money so that we can build these massive projects. We can build lots of cars. We can do these things because we're limiting the liability of the owners of the corporation to that which they have invested. And that overall benefits society. But what Friedman gets wrong is that this idea that everything is about the bottom line ignores the fact that as a society and as the sovereign, that which we grant, we can take away. Corporations get enormous benefits. But if those benefits start to outweigh, if the costs outweigh the advantages, we could take it away. So as a result of this, we have a modified version of the classical model, the moral minimum, which is proposed by a philosopher named Norman Bowie, who says, first of all, corporations have a responsibility to do no harm. In the case of Ford and the Pinto, they knew they were going to do harm to some people. Don't do that. Second, you have a prima facie duty to prevent harm. How do you do that? Well, as a result of the Ford Pinto case and others like that, what do you now get? How many of you have had a recall? How many of you experienced have gotten a notice from a car that you bought that has a recall on it, where they say things like, bring the car in because there's this problem with it. And we're going to fix it for free. I had this Chevy pickup and one of the things that happened with the Chevy pickup that I had bought and the model I bought was that there was this little dent that I guess you could put change. It was on the dashboard, and I guess you could put change or something in that. It was like a little depression area. Turns out that some kid with a big head put his head in there and got it wedged against the windshield. And this created, a problem because they had to pry the kid out. I don't know what they did. They had to pry the kid out, and it did damage to the kid's head or something like that. And so there was this recall on and when I went in to have it serviced, it was a brand new car. And when I went, all of a sudden it comes back, and there's this crappy looking thing that they've screwed into the dad. I'm like, what the hell is this? And they're like, well, there was a recall. We had to do that because some kid got his head stuck in the dent. I don't have a kid. Take it off. Can't do that, sir. Sorry. You have to live. It didn't even match. Like, they didn't even come out with the colors of it. It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen in my life. But we now, as a result of this, have a duty to prevent harm. If you find out these things happen, you have a duty to prevent it. Send out a recall. Third, Bowie says, we can't require, but we should encourage corporations to do good. Now, Milton Friedman would go crazy at this. Encourage them to do good. This idea of Tom's. So what is Tom's known for? Yeah, 1 for 1, right? And lots of companies are now doing this. And this would drive Friedman crazy. He'd say, you're robbing shareholders of their wealth. But it turns out that customers actually people buy Tom's because they do this. And other companies are now modeling that. How many of you have heard the commercials for Bombas socks? Bombas is now doing this 1 for 1 deal. Socks are the most requested items in homeless shelters. And so they're doing 1 for 1. People actually want to do business with people who do things like that. So we should encourage the good. We can't necessarily require it, but we should encourage it. Another version of corporate social responsibility is called the stakeholder theory. Every decision affects a wide range of people, not just the customer, not just the corporation. What we should do is we should reject, according to the stakeholder theory, the privileged position of stockholders. All stakeholders, not just stockholders, should be considered. And you have to balance this among the competing claims of the stakeholders. So who is ultimately a stakeholder, for example, in this endeavor? UCO is a state entity, not a corporation, but it is a legal person, much like corporations, in that UCO can own property, it can be sued in its own name. It's an entity of the state. We have, to some extent, one of the things that gives us a distinction between a state entity and a corporation is that entities of the state have sovereign immunity. Now, because in this country, the people are sovereign, we waive that immunity because people get hurt and bad things happen. We waive that immunity in many instances. What does sovereign immunity mean? Well, in theory, in places like Great Britain, historically, I don't know that this would be true today, one of the things that Donald Trump said was, I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a vote. And it seems to be that, he seems to be getting away with this, not literally shooting people, but he has, what's the lie count up to? and I'm not saying this is a partisan, I mean, this is just objective fact. The man is a compulsive liar. I don't know what the number of lies, but it's over 10,000 lies. Right? Donald Trump is not sovereign in the United States. And so if he shoots somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue, although he may not be able to be prosecuted while he's president, there is no statute of limitations on murder in the United States. And he will be prosecuted after he gets out of office. There is no statute of limitations on murder in this country. And so if he takes his argument to the extreme and actually engages in this, you're going to go to prison. Now, in theory, in places like Great Britain, where the Queen is sovereign, the Queen, she's never said she's going to do this, but monarchs have done this in the past. They kill people, and there's nothing you can do about it because that person is the sovereign. Henry VIII did this. Off with her head to his wife. Poor old Anne. He manages to divorce one wife, sort of, kind of, which was Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. He manages to sort of kind of divorce her by starting his own church because the Pope wouldn't grant him the right to divorce. And he marries Anne Boleyn, who, by the way, had 6 fingers on one hand. And then she fails to produce a son. And so she does produce a child. I believe she produces Elizabeth. So Catherine has a child, not a son, whose name is Mary, if I have my English history correct. Mary ultimately becomes queen after Henry dies. She's a Catholic, her mother's Catholic, and she goes on a tirade and kills a lot of the Protestants. And in fact, there's children's nursery rhymes, by the way, are horrible. How many of you remember the nursery rhyme, Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With cockle shells and something or other, and all lined up in a row. It was a reference to Queen Mary, who stuck the heads of Protestants on spikes outside the Tower of London after she killed them.
Ring around the roses.
Yeah, ring around the roses about the plague, right? So when you get the plague, you get these spots that are called roses, and there's a ring around them. So Mary comes to power, and she's a Catholic, and she hates the fact. I mean, her father did this to her mother, and she virtually imprisons Elizabeth, and she kills a lot of the Protestants. Goes on a little tirade, and there's nothing you can do about this because she is the sovereign, right? So we have sovereign immunity, but because we have this idea that the people are sovereign, we waive that in many instances. If something bad happens to you at UCO, if you slip and fall on the ice that we haven't removed or whatever, you can sue UCO. So we are like a corporation, except that we have this at least limited immunity. And part of the limited immunity is that in order to file a tort claim against UCO, you can't just go file a lawsuit. Like you can if I do something to you, like my colleague Beverly, who used to throw erasers at students' heads, that's a tort. It's also a crime, but it's a tort, and you can sue her personally for that. If the university does something like that to you, you actually have to file what's called a tort claim under the State Tort Claims Act, and that's part of our limit on liability. But we are a constitutional entity. We can own property in our own name. We can sue and be sued for contract and tort and things like that. So when we think about this theory of the stakeholder, and the reason I use UCO as an example of this is students oftentimes tell me, I'm the customer when they're not happy with, I've had students tell me this, when they're not happy with their grade. I'm the customer. This is all really, I grade the essay and you don't like the grade. I'm the customer. I'm paying for this. Well, you're paying for a lot of it, but you're not paying for all of it. The state pays for part of it. And from a stakeholder theory, who else should we consider in this? Sure, I should consider, if you say, look, this is unfair. Your grading of my essay is unfair. Should I just say, well, it's up to me, I can grade it whatever I want, I'm the expert, you're not, get out of my office? Should I be able to say that?
I think it depends.
Look, I just decide I don't like you. I don't like people who wear St. Thomas, Virgin Islands hats. That's morally offensive to me. Your essay is just wrong because you're, obviously, like, you've slacked off. You've been to the Virgin Islands where you should
I
have
thought
been.
you meant like if they didn't like commit to the class or something like that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that students have said to me, I mean, this has been said to me in the past. Students say, I always got A's in high school. Well, okay. This isn't high school, right? I mean, everybody's a winner. I go walking with my friend Brad and my mother on days that she has radiation. So my mother's got breast cancer, and after she goes through radiation, you're supposed to keep your energy and activity level up. So we go walking in the mall, but she can't walk outside because your immune system is compromised and to be out in the cold and stuff like that. So we go walking in the mall. And there's this little game that we play every time when we finish our walk. It's called the duck hunt, and it's this machine that has a scoop in it. How many of you have seen these machines? And the thing that I love about the duck hunt is that you play until you win. You put in $1, and it allows you, most of these games, if you do it at Dave and Buster's or over here at Showbiz, you put in your $1 and you get one shot at it, and if you don't win, you have to put in another $1. The duck hunt game at the Penn Square Mall allows you to play until you win. So you put in your $1 until you get a duck, right? So we get all these stupid rubber ducks. I don't know what I'm going to do with all these crazy, stupid little rubber ducks that we get. But it's fun because at the end of it, and one of the reasons my mother was a high school English teacher at one point in time, one of the reasons that we all like it, and it's funny, is because when you finally get the duck and it drops it into the thing and you pull it, it says, "You're a winner," right? I mean, like, everyone's a winner, right? Everybody's a winner in this game. Well, in life, not everybody can win. And high school is a little bit like that anymore, although it's becoming less like that. They're having more high stakes tests, but everyone's a winner. Everyone gets a trophy. Well, should I consider, if you come to my office during office hours, I think probably I should listen to you. And if your argument is solely based on, I made A's in high school, well, that's not indicative of what you're doing now, right? And the fact that you did that in the past, maybe you wrote beautiful essays in the past. I think I told you all this. I had a student who, on the first essay exam years and years and years ago, wrote. Did I tell you this story? Okay. He wrote, "I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. when wham, bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a circus tumbling routine. And I wrote back, you deserve an F for forcing me to read this drivel, and I think you should take a creative writing course to get this out of your system. Because this is not creative writing. I don't want you to be terrible, you know, I want something that's well written, but I don't need, like, you know, the long, fast, red, low, sleek, beautiful. No, like I don't need that, right? So, I should probably consider your position, but who else is a stakeholder here? If I just give you all A's, who else is a stakeholder here?
You are.
Well, I'm a stakeholder, yeah.
Future
The
employers.
chair,
Future, absolutely. That is probably one of the most important answers. If I give you an A and you get out of here and it turns out you know nothing about marketing and you know nothing about how to make an argument and you know nothing about how to write or communicate, what is somebody going to say? What is an employer going to? They're not going to say you're a horrible person. They're going to say you got a bachelor's degree from UCO, and that degree means nothing. And so I am cheating, you know, if future employers are relying on us to certify that you know something when you leave here, I'm cheating them. And ultimately, I'm not just cheating them. What's going to happen when the next person applies from UCO for a job with that employer?
they may not.
They're going to say, I'm not hiring anybody from UCO. The last person that I hired from here couldn't put two words together in a coherent thought pattern. They were completely, and it dilutes our brand. And ultimately, that dilutes everybody who graduates marketability, doesn't it? Why is it that Harvard has a degree that's worth something? Because they produce a quality product, which is Harvard graduates. It's tough to get into Harvard. It's harder than hell, right? So when I think about these things, I have to think about everybody. The sovereign state of Oklahoma pays for part of your education. I have to think about that. Am I doing a service to my employer, the state of Oklahoma, and ultimately the citizens of the state of Oklahoma? Because they're footing part of your bill. And the reason that they do this, and the reason we do this, is because we know that you're going to go out, and if you have a college education, you're going to be more marketable, you're going to make a higher living, and you're going to pay more in taxes. And there will be a return on that investment in theory. And so I have to think about these. So it's not just thinking about you and this essay. I have to think about the future employers. I have to think about, is this best for you? If I just say you're brilliant and you're wonderful, and I lie to you, and you go out and you lose a job because you know nothing, I've done a disservice to you. I've done a disservice to that employer. I've done a disservice to the brand. I've done a disservice to every other student who goes out and now has to compete and has to now say, yeah, I really did learn something at UCO, right? So I have to think about all of these people, all of the stakeholders among the competing claims. There are criticisms of the stakeholder theory. How do you balance competing rights? So we've talked about this. There's the future employer, there's you, there's all of your fellow classmates in this class. Those are all competing rights. How do I balance that? It becomes an enormous task. If I give you a grade that perhaps you don't deserve, that may benefit you in that you get your degree, And you may go out, and you may get a job, and you may be okay. But how do I balance all of those competing rights? The right of the people of the sovereign state of Oklahoma, they're relying on us to be good stewards of the resources that they've allocated here. I've suggested to you, not just suggested, I've stated, every graduation, we have these people that are from the musical theater department that come and sing, and they're wonderful, and they sing beautifully. But how many of them are going to get a job with that degree? Not many. Lots of people sing well and starve to death. Lots of people try this, right? Very few succeed. Lots of people become sales students now, and the overwhelming number of them succeed. If you get a sales degree from the University of Central Oklahoma, we have a good success rate. Over 95%. Should we end musical theater? You're shaking your head no. Maybe we should.
We should.
Maybe we should say things like, there's one school in the state that's going to do that. That's called OU. Right? Like, we just can't afford. Maybe we should. I don't know. And this is one of the things that I'm pointing out in terms of competing rights. That's a hard question, isn't it? Like, I don't know. From a cost benefit perspective, how do you if we have lots of people, we've got one student who's graduated from UCO that went on to win Miss America, a musical theater major, I believe. I think she was I think I got this right. I think she was a musical theater major. She went on to win Miss America. I'm sure she's, like Oklahoma City University has produced 5 Miss Americas, I think. Jane Giroux, who's on the news, is, and she's very wealthy and she lives in Nichols Hills, and she, I don't know. How do we really decide that? Again, this is a little bit like utilitarian theory. How do you do the calculus on this? And so criticisms of stakeholder theory, say it provides little practical advice. Ultimately, on one exam, let's suppose you just have a bad day and you come in and you say, I'm sorry, I had the flu. There was a deadline. I was sicker than a dog. I was delusional. I was taking Tamiflu, and my doctor prescribed cough syrup with codeine in it. And I had, and I say, what? That I'll just, grade it not on the essay, but on the objective portion of the exam. That seems to be a fair compromise, right? I'll look at your objective. Oh, you got 25 out of 25. I'll give you 100. It's one exam. Is that really going to make a difference over the course of a 4-year history? My mother taught high school in Los Alamos, New Mexico. My father was the special agent in charge for the Northern District of New Mexico for the Federal Bureau of Investigations. And they initially, when she married him, they stationed her and him at Los Alamos. They then moved them to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where I was born in Albuquerque. My brother was born in Santa Fe. We lived in Santa Fe for most of my childhood. Los Alamos, New Mexico is where they invented the bomb. It's this little tiny town, and in that little tiny town, something at that time it was like 10,000 people, 4,000 of whom had PhDs. The rest had either master's degrees or bachelor's degrees. This is far, far above the average. My mother had a student who came, he was an average student. He got a C in her class. But his parents were both PhDs. Both of them were nuclear physicists at the lab. And he came to my mother in tears and he said, if I go home with this grade, I will be beat. My father will beat me. What do you do in that situation? I'm out of time. We will finish this next time and move on to the next chapter. There's the roll sheet if you need it.